Welcome everyone. I'm Chris Golden, an Associate Professor of Nutrition and Planetary Health here at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and moderator of today's discussion. I'm delighted to be joined by today's panelists. We have Julia Olson, Co-Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel for Our Children's Trust, Kari Nadeau, Chair of the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health, and John Rock Professor of Climate and Population Studies, and Alicia Yeaman, Lecturer on Law and the Senior Fellow on Global Health and Rights at the Petrie Flom Center at Harvard Law School, and Adjunct Senior Lecturer on Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health. Our Children's Trust is a nonprofit public interest law firm that represents young people in landmark lawsuits designed to secure their rights to a healthy environment. Let's watch a clip courtesy of Our Children's Trust so we can hear some from those young people. Thank you.
In 2018, when I lost my house in a flood, it was due to a tropical hurricane. Climate change definitely had something to do with the drastic changes in the weather and in the fire that just happened. If we don't act now for climate change, we're only going to see more of these disasters, and that's not what I want for my future.
It's not about the government being wrong or these people being evil. It's about changing an unhealthy pattern of behavior that's harming Montana's people.
This trial is barely about our generation right now. We know it's about our futures, but it's about future generations too. We're fighting for them, not just us.
We will not allow the federal government to silence our voices. We will continue to stand in our courts, in our streets, and on the front lines of fossil fuel infrastructure until every pipeline has been shut down.
Our Children's Trust is dedicated exclusively to representing children and youth in courts to stop the climate crisis. The future of 2 billion children is threatened by climate change. Young people deserve to be happy and safe today and in the future. We use our legal and scientific expertise so they can tell their stories. We build the capacity of youth plaintiffs to grow as leaders. In turn, they hold their governments accountable and they advocate for science-powered climate action to protect their own rights to a safe climate.
Julia, can you discuss the underlying legal framework that underscores your mission to universal children's climate rights?
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Our Children's Trust, we're really based on 3 core principles, and it's this idea that children and young people who will suffer the impacts of climate change more than anybody else and for the longest period of time, both because they're unique physiologically and mentally, as we'll hear from Kari, but also just because a child born in 2020 is really born into a crisis and a situation that's dangerous. So we uplift these young voices to protect their rights through our legal systems here in the United States and around the world, and also to be heard on a public platform. So we help them do interviews with media and journalists so that they can be part of the public discourse. We help them go and testify before congressional bodies and be heard before administrative bodies. And so that's a really vital component of what we do. And we're in fact the only law firm on the planet that exclusively represents youth on the climate crisis. The second really important principle is we're looking for science-based systemic remedies to the crisis. In my prior career as a public interest environmental attorney, I like to say that I played this game of whack-a-mole, where we were fighting one power plant here, or one pipeline project here, and doing a lot of defense. And we really need visionary systemic approaches to correcting this problem that is not just about one part of the fossil fuel system, but really the entire system that government is promoting and subsidizing and allowing to move forward. And the third component is I really shifted my lens when I had children and realized that the climate crisis, yes, it's an environmental issue, but it can't just be solved through environmental law. That really, at its core, it is a human rights issue and a children's rights issue. And so I pivoted from environmental statutory laws and started looking at constitutions and human rights laws wherever they're found. And so every case we bring is about children's fundamental human rights and we use the legal structures that are in place to protect those. Here in the United States, it's often the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment or state constitutions that protect right to life and liberty.
Thank you. So much of the legal work that our Children's Trust is doing relies on robust scientific evidence linking climate change to human health. And Kari, I'm wondering, can you tell us the state of that evidence and what do we know about particular vulnerabilities, both demographically and geographically?
Thank you, Chris, for that question. The evidence is absolutely there. It's incontrovertible that climate change is real, and importantly, that climate and health are inextricably related to each other, and that we have a lot of room to go, but there is a lot of room for hope now because our recent Conference of the Parties, for example, in the Middle East this year, 148 countries signed on to a declaration which said that climate and health are related. And importantly, now we need to focus on solutions. But a lot of this came from science. How do we know that climate and health are related? And let's talk about it for children, because I agree with Julia that it is a very important human right to make sure that we have access to nature that is healthy, especially for children. So when we think about some of those climate change events that have affected either you or your families or other people that you know or people in the news, let's talk about heat first. With heat, we know that in 2023, this was the hottest year ever in 100,000 years. The average child today will be born in a world that suffers through twice as many heat waves as when I was a child. That's a lot of heat waves. Why is that important? That can increase asthma for children. That can increase suicide rates for their parents or for teenagers. And it can affect their cognition. So for every degree Fahrenheit increase, if you take that same test as a child, you'll have a decrease in your percentage of the test result. Just think of that. 20-degree difference means 20 points less on a specific cognitive test. So that affects the brain. And that's just heat. Let's think about some of these other effects with climate change and health. The drought. So we have a lot of people in this planet, especially in the global south, that are affected by drought and food insecurity. That leads to displacement. We have about 213 million people displaced every year due to climate change related events. And of that, the majority are women and children. That's going to lead to mental health issues as well. And so that we have to protect our children under those conditions. Flooding is also a major issue. We saw that in Pakistan. And one flooding event can lead to cholera. Children, especially, can have at least a 50% fatality rate with cholera. Vector-borne diseases are another issue around climate and health. And children are at a high risk for that, especially children that live in areas that are inequitably exposed, that already are exposed to toxic events, for example, that have been red zoned, the vulnerable populations that Chris was alluding to. Children are especially vulnerable, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So those communities that are suffering through environmental justice, that are on borders of red-lined communities that have been unfortunately discriminated against, the children in those communities are even at a higher risk. So for example, their immune systems, because of the stress, for example, of potentially being a person of color, in addition to a vector-borne disease, that makes them very low likely to be able to combat that disease. So all of these issues around climate and health are there. We need to focus on solutions now, but especially for children, because thanks to Julia and thanks to others now, they're gaining their voice, and because the youth movement is gaining voice here in this country, but up to now they have been those that have been suffering the most from climate change related events, but have had no voice. So to me, this is a moral imperative that we act now, and we help those that typically have been affected most and suffered the most from climate change, and we need to leave no one behind, especially children.
Thank you, Kari. You point to so much evidence about how climate change will impact all people, and particularly children, across all corners of the earth. And yet every nation, and often states or populations within nations, will have different legal protections. And so Alicia, I'm wondering, can you share a bit about what geographical scale is best for addressing these concerns?
Sure. Well, thank you again, Chris, for including me in this conversation. You know, it's a complicated question because not only do each every country has its own legal and policy framework, and sometimes subnational units like states, as Julia already mentioned. Sometimes there are regional treaties that also are incorporated into domestic law that affect this. So, for example, in Latin America, almost every country in Latin America has enshrined the right to a safe and healthy environment in their constitutions, and a number of countries have enshrined actually rights of nature, so they're not just human rights. It's an idea of rights that go more to one health actually than just human health. But there are also differences in terms of enforceability, in terms of standing, as Julia alluded to, because in many cases, children don't have access to courts and they can't vote, which is what goes to a lack of voice and a democratic problem. There are problems when courts just don't have the ability to enforce judgments because of resistance from the political organs of government. In some cases, we have seen courts issue judgments that apply to what are called extraterritorial obligations that are transboundary activities, and I think that's a very exciting and promising area to rein in some of the countries in the global north that actually contribute most to climate change. But another aspect of this is the political economy, right? Because different countries do contribute more or less, and climate is, as Julia pointed out, is not something that can be attacked in isolation. Pakistan was underwater in terms of real flooding, but it was also underwater in terms of debt. And when we're asking national governments to do climate adaptation, in addition to a whole lot of other things, and yet they are spending so much on debt servicing, we have to figure out what we really mean by leaving no one behind, right? Then the same thing goes with multinational international taxation rules that allow fossil fuel companies to deduct the royalties they pay from taxes. So,
thank you. Julia, I wonder if I could ask you a similar question. How does your approach differ in each state? How does it differ between the US and your international work? And kind of transcending that, what are the core elements that don't change regardless of the geography and population you're trying to protect?
Yeah, good question. So I'll start by talking about the United States. So from the beginning, in 2010, when we started putting together our first round of cases on behalf of youth, we knew we needed a state and a federal approach to securing constitutional climate rights for young people. And so we've always worked state by state. And every state has a slightly different constitution, and every state is playing a different role in the climate crisis. So our recent trial last summer in Montana, in the Held versus Montana case, it was the first constitutional climate trial in history here, where 16 youth went and held their government accountable. 12 of them testified. And Montana's problem is they have some of the largest fossil fuel resources in the United States, and they had never, in at least 40 years, denied a permit for extracting those fuels. And they're a huge gateway for other fuels coming from Canada and a big exporter. And so we were challenging laws that were really promoting that fossil fuel practice and requiring the state to ignore climate change while it was permitting all of those activities. And in Montana, they also have a constitution that, like the Latin American countries, expressly protects the right to a clean and healthful environment. So it gave us a special hook, in addition to the rights to life and safety and security and equal protection of the law. So we go state by state to look at what is the state doing that's really contributing to the problem, and what's the best constitutional hook to protect children's rights. And in the U.S. Constitution, it's the Fifth Amendment. So using the Substantive Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, one of our new federal cases is really trying to carve out the equal protection rights that children should have especially in the face of government acting in ways that harm kids. Globally, it is different. Some countries have really amazing constitutions, and Alicia and I were talking earlier about it depends on the institutional structure of the courts as to whether you can really enforce those constitutions. So again, we're just looking country by country and working with partners in country to determine how best can we advocate for youth. And just to wrap up the answer, the thing that remains constant throughout all of these cases is the children's harms from climate change that are already occurring are the heart of the story, and the science doesn't change. So we're bringing the best science forward. Specifically, the safe target climate scientists have identified, which is we need to return atmospheric carbon dioxide to below 350 parts per million and not allow continued increase in temperatures because of the heat and related effects that are really harming our children.
And I'm curious how this work then connects with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular Article 3, which states quite simply that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And I'm wondering if you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, actually on December 10th, which was, if you may know, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we filed our new case against the U.S. government. It's called Genesis versus U.S. EPA on that day as a signal and a recognition of that document. And I spoke about the document on that day, and what's interesting about the Universal Declaration is it barely mentions children, and when it does, it's really in the context of parental rights. And so I think where we're trying to push the law and evolve the law today is for judges and lawyers and politicians to understand that the law really centers adults, and it doesn't center children. And if we can move the law in the direction of protecting children in communities, no matter what the community is, then we can really protect everybody in a community, and we can protect nature in much better ways. So I think that's where the declaration needs to move, or that concept.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And so I think we're realizing that climate change mitigation alone will not solve all of our problems, and we must also prepare and adapt to the health impacts that we're already feeling and that we will continue to feel into the future. And so Kari, what can researchers do to produce evidence that will be useful to policymakers, clinicians, and communities?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we are now in the time where we absolutely must act now. The IPCC report from 2022 says, we are in red alert, and this was made by extremely well-renowned scientists that are well-respected. And again, the area of children's health is sort of lacking, but we need to push scientists forward on that. And the data is being collected. So I think, to answer your question, before we start adapting and before we start to think about this globally and then country to country, we need to make sure that we measure what matters most, and we need to make sure that we measure it so that then we can best try to help. And UNICEF wrote a great report in complementary synergy with the IPCC report that says that any child born today in the world will suffer through at least one climate change event. And that will be a severe weather condition. And that's just a single one. That's at least. Most children now on this planet will suffer through more than one, especially those that are inequitably exposed in the global south. And then you think of that compounding over someone's life course, as well as mixed effects, not just a climate change event, but also they could be having exposure to pollutants or toxins. And so we study this, and scientists need to look at studying solutions now. And I think that's important. And I want to give you some areas of hope now, because as scientists, we can take our quantification methods that we do so well, especially in the public health field, and that can help regulators and help policymakers move forward, and help litigators and lawyers look at the attribution of certain climate change events to health outcomes in children and how that might be inducing bodily harm. And what I like to do is flip it around and say, well, we know that climate is bad for the health of children, but what about the solutions? Because that proves even more that something could have been attributed to that health effect and climate change. So studies have been done. Now we know that for every dollar put in, especially in New England, this was actually not a modeled study, it was done and published already through Boston University and other colleagues that work in this area. For every dollar put in to renewable energy, you get $6 out in health co-benefits alone. And why does that make sense? Well, there's now data to show that if you just reduce a diesel bus to using cleaner fuel, just cleaner fuel, that's not even going to an electric bus, that can reduce asthma exacerbations in children within 30 days by 30%. 30 days. And the bus driver benefits too. So this is data that we're focusing on as scientists because we believe in data, we believe in science, but we need to make sure it gets brought to policymakers. What other things help? Well, we talk a lot about greening and wilding because that's important to get access to nature. Not only is it important as a human right, but it's important for our well-being and our mental health. So children, they've done control studies where children are placed in sort of a more concrete jungle nursery school versus a nursery school, same socioeconomic status, controlling for everything else, but this nursery school was wild. Within 30 days, the cognition scores improve. The immune status improves. The vaccine responses improve in those children. So these are unintended consequences that are beneficial to be able to make solutions count and that we as scientists need to measure. And the other thing that we've measured is, we in general as scientists, if you increase tree canopy by 30% in a city, you can reduce premature deaths by 1/3. So these are all really important scientific areas of inquiry where we can have that data and that data science to be able to make compelling evidence, to be able to help policymakers move the argument forward, and to help our legal colleagues move the argument forward of attribution. So I'm excited that we're part of that. But we also need to be, as scientists, good role models. And so I think that we have a lot of movement to move forward in terms of being able to ensure that our own institutions practice really good abilities to message and communicate well, to bring our science to policymakers and to the public.
Thank you. Lisa, I'd like to ask you a similar question. What can researchers do to produce useful evidence, particularly from a kind of legal policy standpoint? So how are you thinking this could be brought to engage with policymakers or legal scholars?
Well, I think many of the things Kari mentioned are incredibly relevant to policymaking as well as to arguing in front of courts, right? And I think a lot of the evidence thus far has been has been abundantly used in the kind of stop doing bad things kind of way, right? Stop polluting in this way that is creating an asthma problem in a city. Stop doing this. But I think increasingly scientists are bringing evidence to bear that shows what in legal terms we talk about as appropriate steps and measures. So it's very complicated, right? It's what are the different options? What are going to be the inadvertent, unintended consequences? And that evidence, bringing that evidence to bear to show whether governments are actually taking appropriate measures as opposed to just possibly ineffective measures is absolutely essential. And I think that's being done more and more, as is in kind of these larger structural cases and sometimes in monitoring policies as well in some countries, monitoring, so bringing to bear evidence and interpreting what they learn through monitoring judgments, monitoring administrative regulations, monitoring new legislation, and that's also that feedback loop is very important. I will say this one caveat. There are going to be areas of scientific uncertainty. We saw that during the pandemic. Knowledge moves, and there are legal doctrines that can help us manage that. If there's a doctrine called in dubio pro natura. So even when there is scientific uncertainty, you internalized precaution and in favor of what would be in favor of nature and nature's rights. And the second thing that I think is important to realize is, as much as public health expertise is absolutely fundamental, we also learned in the pandemic that one size doesn't fit all, and experts' views can't cover what happens to all kinds of discriminated or disadvantaged populations. And the idea that you're bringing to bear voices of people, lived experiences who are affected, is extremely important in interpreting what the scientific evidence means. And I think that's one of the powerful lessons from our Children's Trust's work.
Fantastic. That was really useful. And given these responses, I'd like to point this question to you now. What types of research or other support is most needed for you to successfully do your job?
Well, I'm getting all sorts of ideas about research just as we have this conversation. I think, so the medical research has been instrumental to our cases. It's just been vital because being able to present before a judge what pediatricians and psychiatrists are saying is happening to children in the face of climate crisis has been just vital to us being able to win in Montana, for example. So I'm so appreciative of that. The other piece of research that is really helpful and that I think we need more of is we have experts who are talking about how we do the energy transition. So moving from a fossil fuel-based system to a clean, renewable energy system. And people like Dr. Mark Jacobson out of Stanford have modeled how we do this around the United States and I think in 137 or 141 countries. And he's looking at it at a very granular level, but what he's not doing is going sort of state by state or country by country and creating the plans and mapping out where do you put the renewable energy resources. And so I think taking his work to the next level and putting it on the ground, because what I saw in our trial in Montana is if there was anything that gave people hope, it was his testimony. You know, knowing that this can be done, it can be done by 2040, 2045, but at the latest 2050, and having a vision for how we get there is going to be really, really vital. And then I think there's more and more research being done on the mental health effects of climate change on children and young people. I think it would be really interesting to do more sort of social science research on what world do children want to live in, you know, and what do they want and what are their ideas? We get a lot of that information in working with youth, but I think having a broader study on that to present to policymakers could really inform policy. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, for organizations like ours, we depend on individual donations and support to do this work. We represent young people entirely pro bono. We rely on the pro bono expertise of people like Kari and Alicia to help us do this work. And so having volunteers and donations is what our Children's Trust needs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems like each of you is taking a different approach to tackling the threat that climate change poses to intergenerational equity. And I'd like to ask each of you to explain, maybe in just a few sentences, where do you draw your motivation from and why is this such an important issue to you on a personal level? We just go down the line. Yeah, sure,
okay.
Please.
So I've always been a huge nature lover. My favorite place to be is on the top of a mountain. I just came from snow in Colorado with my family. And it was when I had children and I looked in their eyes that I said, I have got to use everything in my toolkit and in my power to leave them a better world and work on climate crisis. So for me, it's the kids in my life motivate me enormously and children around the world, really.
I'm motivated by I think what's affected me and my patients. So as a parent, I agree with Julia. You know, being able to be in nature, having this privilege of being where I am in my life, and being very humbly happy with that, and having children that can appreciate the planet. but that there are many children, people of color, especially those that are impoverished, that have never gone to our national parks, they don't really even understand how we could perhaps grow a product that they don't even know how a broccoli plant is made, for example, that they eat. So things like this disturbed me as a pediatrician, and that I had a lot of patients that grew up in the Central Valley that had unfortunately suffered through 100 out of 365 days of wildfire smoke. And that really affected their lungs. Their lung development was different from just an area of the country 3 hours away, because wildfire smoke is extremely toxic. It contains paint thinners and detergents, and that's not good for children's lungs. So I think that really inspired me to get moving. And then after I had to evacuate my own home with my own children and all my pets 3 times due to wildfire smoke, I knew that I had to pivot and really focus on solutions and environmental health. So I think those things have motivated me. But what inspires me is the fact that we have a youth movement, that we have our children's trust, that we have scientists now here at the Public Health School and at Harvard University and with Salata Institute to be able to think about solutions to these problems, so that even though there are issues every day that you read in the news that could otherwise perseverate you towards sort of a very negative, pessimistic view, I view that those things need to be highly motivating to be able to try to change the world. And that's what inspires me, that those paths are being made and we need to be part of that pathway.
So I guess listening to Julia, I came to this sort of in the opposite direction, because I've been a human rights lawyer for 30 years. I've lived in 7 countries on 4 different continents. I've really worked on economic and social rights, and in particular on health rights for all of that time, doing litigation and organizing and movement building, and working a lot in indigenous communities, especially in Latin America, and seeing their relationship with nature, which is quite different. And as political economy has evolved, and even as transformative constitutionalism has allowed us and given us bigger toolkits, it's quite clear that the world we live in is not, as another article in the Universal Declaration, Article 28 says, which says everyone is entitled to a social and international order that guarantees the enjoyment of rights to everyone. That is not possible with what is happening to the planet. And I see climate change as part of a broader kind of predatory extractivism, in terms of labor extractivism and increasingly informal economies, in terms of extractivism of unremunerated care, in many ways. And so I see it as part of interlocking, intersecting systems that deny people and nature people dignity, children dignity, future generations dignity, and deny nature in the sense that indigenous people talk about Pachamama and mountain gods and Apus, also some kind of respect.
Thank you, and I just want to say what inspiring words you've shared, and it's such an honor for me to be on this panel with you all. To end, I'd like to ask each of you to give some advice for our audience. And people in this country and across the globe are worried about these risks that climate pose to themselves and their own health and to our future. And what can we do to best protect ourselves? And I wonder if I could just ask us to go down the line, and maybe, Alicia, I'll ask you to start and we can go in reverse order this time.
So I would say first, echoing something that Kari said, reject nihilism and fatalism. You know, nothing is preordained that is going to happen in the next years. We are the creators of the future. So first of all, educate yourself, get engaged in whatever way that means, and don't succumb to fatalism, which is so, and complacency. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, echoing that, it's such an excellent point. I think there is a lot we can do to protect ourselves and protect each other and protect the planet. and understand in all humility that we have the choice in terms of our own extinction, but that this planet will be around for a very long time. And that work that Chris is doing, for example, that we're inextricably related to our health and planetary health, is critical, to be very humble in that. I also think that in order to protect ourselves and protect the planet, having a viewpoint where we can move the needle forward, that we know and can educate ourselves, absolutely. But all of you are here because you are being curious, and also having to listen to communities that otherwise perhaps might not be so curious, but they don't know what they don't know. And so all of you, I hope today, will multiply the message, that you will institute these things that you learned today and multiply, maybe just one other person, but you can be that change to protect yourselves and also protect others. The United Nations, the WHO, the Environmental Protection Agency, the CDC, has some wonderful educational platforms that are available, and that can help you protect yourselves and your families, but also help, again, multiply this message to others. Thank you.
Okay, I'll say 3 things. So 1, listen to young people. Like if you have a young person in your life, ask them what they think about climate crisis and how they feel and what their experience is. And then if you're an adult, figure out how you can use your skill set to stand alongside a youth, not in front of them and not behind them, expecting them to be your hope, but really how can you support them and be a mentor, be an advocate with them, because that's what they want, right? They don't want us to do it for them, and they don't want to be our heroes. So, engage with young people. They really do have the solutions. And the second thing is, don't give up on democracy and all branches of government. I think it takes vigilance and work, and we will never be done with growing the more perfect nation that we're trying to embody, or the more perfect world. Like, there will always be injustice, and we have to keep working for justice. And so that leads me to the third thing: we have to do it joyfully. Right? So we dance before we go into court as a team. We work with a trauma consultant. We do a lot of mindfulness work and breath work. And so find ways to be in community and be healthy while we journey through this incredible moment in history.
Thank you. I really want to thank all of you for being here today for this insightful discussion. And we hope to see all of you next time, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.